Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a frontline update for the Ukraine War frontline update for the 11th of July 2025. I think this is a 4-day update. I think that's the last time I did one was on the 7th. So this is actually fairly soon after my last one comparatively compared to what I'm doing in terms of the mapping at the moment, and that's because I'm getting quite a lot of data coming in that looks a little bit interesting. It's a bit of a polka dot scenario along the front line. There are a lot of red dots or puce cherry red dots suggesting that the Ukrainians have been pushed back, that the Russian defensive line has pushed forward in a number of places, but also quite a few areas along the front where the Russian front line has been pushed back, their defensive line, has been pushed back, and that's indicated by the blue dots. So remember, the dark blue and the darker puce ones are Suryat Mat's pro-Russian mapper, suggesting either the Russian line has been pushed back or the Russian line defensive line has pushed forward. The blue light, the lighter blue ones and the lighter pink ones are Andriivka's map indications that the Russian defensive line has been either pushed back here, light blue, or in the pink ones, there aren't any in this area, that the Russian defensive line has pushed forward. Okay, we're going to go to Tetkino, where I think the Ukrainians are still giving the Russians a lot to think about here, but Surat map suggests that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back to the border in this easterly area, and that would be significant if it's true, because actually the Ukrainians were pushing through into this area and cutting off the main supply route into Tetkino. There were claims that they had control over these kind of waterworks there and were possibly in this wooded area over here. So that's interesting that Surat Maps indicates the Russians have pushed back there. I don't know if that's definitely the case. Surat Maps, not always on point, should we say. But that's Tetkino. There's a lot of talk going on concerning this whole area here. So if you remember, the Russians pushed the Ukrainians back. The Ukrainians have pushed into the Kursk Oblast and had got as far as, well, Koronevo in... so Koronevo was up here. So pretty much the outskirts of Koronevo. They got all the way up there and kind of over to here. They were trying to take all of Glushkovo and at the area south of the same river over here, but they failed. So really they had this kind of area into the Russian border. So this is into the Russian territory. This is the Russian border there. And the Ukrainians are all the way up there. And then they got pushed back to the border, and the Russians kept on going with that momentum. They pushed the Ukrainians back south of the Ukrainian border and into Sumy Oblast. Then you have Sumy city here. What the Russians wanted to do was to get closer and closer to this forested area so that their artillery could pummel Sumy. A bit like what they tried to do in Kharkiv, but didn't quite succeed there either. Now, the same situation here, where the Ukrainians put a stop to the Russian advances and have actually been reversing those advances. So we had seen previously that the Russians have been pushed back in this wooded area around Sadki, and have been struggling to get further south of Yablonivka. The Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back a little bit there, and Yunikivka here. And now we are seeing that the Ukrainians are having quite a bit of success over on this left flank, over on the west here. So we go to some of our sources. Here, David D talks about this being called the turning the flank here. So the effort is to push the Russians back over here. So the Ukrainian forces have broken the back of the Russian Marine Task Force on the far west of the Sumy pocket, and a mostly airborne task force of the Ukrainian Armed Forces is pushing Russian forces back to the Russian border tonight. So the claim is, in fact, there are some claims that they got as pretty close to the border, back to the Russian border. We'll come on to that. Good news from the Sumy region. After recapturing Andriivka, Russians are now pushed out of the Konstantinivka grey zone still, and Ukrainian forces have now moved into Kindrativka, trying to secure this border town. And then this is where we talk about getting close to the border. So Kondrativka, if you can see here, is there. We're going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. So the 79th Air Assault Brigade advancing north of Kondrativka village, and they've taken control of at least 3 square kilometers north of the village there. The Ukrainian fighters from the brigade were situated hundreds of meters south of the Konstantinivka village near the Russian border. Okay, so if we zoom in here, so this is the westerly side of the area that the Russians have taken inside Sumy. They've already been halted around Novomykhailivka, Oleksiivka, Yablonivka, and Yunakivka, as I've mentioned previously. Andriivka is a village that the Ukrainians have retaken. There are claims of fighting over Oleksiivka. And then I'm going to come over to Kindrativka here, where apparently the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back. Certainly north of the village there. Actually, Andriivka has the Russian defensive line all the way over here. Surat map still has the Russians oddly in control of an area south of the village, and indeed pretty much half of the village or town of Kondrativka. Whereas other mappers, they're not so charitable to the Russians here, and it could be that the Ukrainians are advancing north of that settlement. So actually pushing the Russians back to the border area here, that they're approaching Kostyantynivka. And indeed, Andriivka has the Russian defensive line somewhere like that. If we look at some of these other sources here, you can see Max 25 reporting that Kondrativka in the Sumy region, the Ukrainian soldiers broke into the northern part of the settlement. So here has the Russians still in control of that southern area, but this was going back to the 8th. That's now 3 days ago. So it's likely, as you can see here, that the Ukrainians have now liberated the whole of Kondrativka, and that's what Grayscale says on their map here. Then we have a couple of claims that are coming from the Russians themselves. So Sumy region, Kondrativka, Oleksiivka area. So remember, this is Kondrativka, this is Oleksiivka. So this sector in the area there. So the first Russian source said, and this is going back to yesterday, the situation remains very tense. The Ukrainians are trying to enter the center of the village and have been already practically cut off our Marines from supplies. They also continue to advance north of Andriivka and towards Oleksiivka. From our side, reinforcements have finally begun to be transferred to the area. But again, as I wrote earlier, judging by the broadcast, there are a lot of mercenaries from the Ukrainians here, as from this area, right, it's effing not here. The translation's a bit weird there. Okay, so there are claims that there are mercenaries. What that could refer to is, for example, I showed you photographs of Colombians and others who are part of a unit of the 47th Brigade. They are not mercenaries, but they are fighting for the Ukrainians as volunteers. It depends how you define the term and whether you see it as a pejorative and whether, etc., etc. Anyway, whatever. It could be that you've got elements of those kind of units fighting here, but they are pushing the Russians back all around here, possibly, pushing north of Andriivka as well as into Oleksiivka. Then another statement has come out from the North Channel here. This came out today. Kindrativka, yesterday was difficult. Today is an effing mess, and I'm putting it mildly. The situation in a day has gone from command sees everything to, if we don't hurry up by tomorrow, there will be no one to save. The fighting is already in the very center of the village. The infantry of the 30th MRR is on its last legs. They have no people, no ammunition, no rotation. That's all. To unblock the area, we are introducing reserves from the 9th Motorized Rifle Regiment into battle and removing the reconnaissance company from the 30th from Oleksiivka, where they were helping the 155th to gain a foothold. So remember, the 155th is operating here. These are the Marines that were down in Vuhledar, got absolutely mauled a number of times in Vuhledar, then eventually came up here with the 810th, both Naval Infantry Brigades, Marines. And they are, they're probably staging in Koronova at the moment, because there was recently a Storm Shadow strike on Koronova that took out the entire leadership, as I reported this morning, of the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade. You've also had strikes on Lugov up here, and where are you, Rilsk, and Rilsk as well, which might be further over to, you've got Kursk over there, and anyway, you've got Rilsk somewhere here. I can't even see now, too many places. Oh, Rilsk over here. So Rilsk and Lugov, but particularly Rilsk actually, because it's closer. This is kind of a staging post. This is where you get command, HQs and maybe troop accumulations. Rilsk is getting hit routinely. It was hit last night again. Koronova was hit, as I said the other day, and it took out the command of the 155th. So then if you're talking about how the 155th are doing here, well, they're lacking command for a start. So they are going to be really, really struggling. So they were counting on the Marines in this area, says this source continuing. But the 177th Regiment has not yet been restored, and they have no other reserves yet. The problem needs to be solved. We need to pull our own out. This is a Russian saying, we need to pull out from here. We are in trouble. Now, we heard rumours that maybe reinforcements are coming up from Zaporizhzhia up to here. That could affect whether Zaporizhzhia is going to be an area where the Russians are going to be pushing in a formal offensive. But it's looking sort of better news for the Ukrainians here. They seem to have the wind behind their sails in the Sumy area. That's really good news, because you don't want the city of Sumy to come under real pressure from the Russians there. So yeah, Ukrainians are regaining positions in the area. What else do we have from Vizhina? Sumy direction, the real hell continues in the area. This is a quote: in the area of Kondrativka and Oleksiivka, reserves and fresh forces are urgently needed. The enemy is methodically destroying the 155th Brigade. Has everyone really given up on the Marines after the loss of their command? Russian military bloggers are panicking, says Vizhina, looking at this quote, over the deteriorating situation in Sumy. And it's not just the sort of regular ground forces doing their thing. It's also the Ukrainian Air Force absolutely hammering some of these areas with the guided glide bombs that they seem to be using far more freely now. MiG-29 carries out a precision strike using the AASM HAMMER, the French guided glide bombs, on Russian troop concentrations in Oleksiivka in the Sumy region. So you can see, more buildings absolutely shellacked there by guided glide bombs. So the Ukrainians using combined arms and combined arms tactics around here to gain an advantage, certainly the western side. Haven't heard too much about this, the rest of that sector over the last few days. Surat claims that the Russians have pushed further to the east, actually nearer to where Ukraine still arguably has some presence inside the Russian border, although possibly not anymore. Around the Gornau monastery that's there. That's kind of the last vestiges of the Ukrainian presence where they were originally up in Kursk, and that there could be an area the other side of the border here, according to Andriivka, that's a grey zone. Surat Maps has the Russians now in control of that, but not confirmed yet by Andriivka. Okay, so it's all happening up there in Sumy. That's an area where the Ukrainians are having some success. That's good news, obviously, for them there. Then we're going to come down to the Kupiansk-Svatove-Kreminna sector, and we're going to start with some good news around Kupiansk, north of Kupiansk. So both mappers indicating that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back north of Kupiansk, with Andriivka's mapping very different to Surat Maps there, particularly around the Kalinove area. But both of them showing the Ukrainians having some success there, so that's good news. In fact, right down the front, really, from now, for most of the way down the front line, you will see just a huge difference between Surat Maps and Andriivka, and that's worth noting. So, this area of sort of orange shading, that is the other side of the blue line. This blue line here is Andriivka's indication of where the Russian defenses are at. That's the Russian defensive line. The Russians robustly control that area and can supply that area to some degree. Anywhere south of there in this particular area, or west up there, it will be a grey zone for some amount of land, and then there'll be a Ukrainian defensive line further in that direction. So there's just a big difference of opinion between where the Russian defensive line is, and as you can see, many kilometers in certain places. Anyway, as we come down from Kupiansk, where there is some good news, we see there's a bit of a challenge over here for the Ukrainians, as the Russians appear to have slightly more land in the Zeleny High area. This was an area, north of here, north of Lozova, where the Ukrainians have been pushing the Russians back. Zaporizhzhia here and Lozova. So the Russians have been on the back foot there as they have pushed up to the Oskil River in that area. But it seems that further to the south, the Russians may have had more success, or at least there's data to confirm that they control more area than previously thought. And then around Kupianki, small village there. According to Soviet maps, the Russians have been pushed back a little bit, but nothing too much to write home about. And then we come down to the area of sort of Torska. The Russians are really marching on further towards the west here. Zelenya Donya, they have basically taken that village, and they're moving on. That's 4 days worth of movement, and they've achieved quite a bit there. It's pretty worrying as they're getting closer and closer to Oskil over here, the Oskil River, and then some of these settlements over here that were fought over when Izium was retaken. Yeah, Izium's up there. And yeah, the lightning counteroffensive took these back, and now the Russians are having some joy there. But the Ukrainians are taking some land back in a place called Rydkutub. We talked about this previously. The Ukrainians had last mapping update had some success here, and they've actually pushed back further here by all accounts. So here is an interpretation. This is 3 days old, but it's now confirmed that assault units of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, as a result of the counteroffensive, managed to break through in the direction of the village of Katyniivka in the Donetsk Oblast and liberated part of the settlement. At the same time, they entered the southern part of the village of Rydkutub and fortified their positions there. So they have had some success moving towards Katyniivka and having some success around Rydkutub. So not all lost for the Ukrainians there. They are certainly pushing back, but that is definitely a bit of a worry. I mean, it's not like a massive concern, like I've said a number of times. All of this area, really, up to the Oskil River, is up for grabs. And as long as the Ukrainians bleed the Russians for every kilometre they take, then jobs are good in there. Good to see no change for 4 days. In 4 days in the Serebryantski forest and really south of there, around what was Belaharivka on the way to Siversk. So the Ukrainians getting pushed here quite a bit. The Russians getting closer and closer to Siversk. Although, as you can see here, there's a massive difference of opinion between the two mappers over who controls what, with Andriivka much more conservatively having the Russians back in Velyka area, whereas Soviet maps has them advancing way further, getting towards Siversk there. So good to see no change to the mappers there, and good to see no change to the mappers around the Bakhmut Cheziv Yar sort of area, because the Russians have been having some success around Cheziv Yar, pushing the Ukrainians out. Remember, that was supposed to be taken by summer last year. It wasn't. Ukrainians have done a fabulous job of holding on here, but they've been under a lot of pressure there recently. You can see another huge difference between the mappers here, as Andriivka has the Russian defensive line much further to the east here than Soviet maps, and that's the same, as I say, right the way around the front. You can see that change of shading there all over the Toretsk front here. This sector has been really difficult for the Ukrainians. We're going to have a little look at that. You can see that Andriivka has a tiny bit of gain for the Ukrainians around here, or that could be a bit of a glitch because actually he's got their defensive line all the way back there. Anyway, let's go to a few of the sources here. Visioner says, big news, Ukrainian forces have advanced on the Donetsk front in the Siversk direction following successful counteroffensives. After several days of tactical assaults, Ukrainian assault units pushed the enemy out of key strongholds, regained lost positions, and advanced closer to the Luhansk border in this sector. So that's actually going back up to Siversk. You can see the Belaharivka, the white chalk open cast mine there. Let's just pop into there because I think this is important. I should have recognized that I had that one coming up. Okay, so you've got Syriac maps showing that the Russians are in control of the area north of that lake there, and we'll see how that looks over here. So yeah, over to the north, just along the Siversky Donetsk River, the Russians do seem to have that control, according to Visioner as well. And then they do have some control north of that lake. But according to Visioner, the Ukrainians are pushing back in this area as well as to some degree over here, and the Russians are not as far as Syriac maps would have you believe. So pushing back in the Siversk area, good news there. Then we have Yablunivka in a Konstantynivka direction. So let's go back to Toretsk here. So let's just get us a sense of where we are. Sorry, because I make too many assumptions that everyone knows where places are on the map. So we got Bakhmut. Bakhmut there, Chasiv Yar. You've got Kostyantynivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and then up to Siversk up here, all the way over there. So you've got a kind of semicircle of towns that are really vulnerable to strikes by the Russians in terms of, these get hit by Shahid drones as well as all sorts of other drones routinely. It's really difficult for the Ukrainians, but it's very important they keep hold of these towns. These are important industrial areas. Konstantinivka is under a lot of pressure from many sides, as you can see. So the Russians are advancing through Toretsk, but they've had a really difficult time. The Ukrainians have held on there, and there still is some Ukrainian presence in Toretsk, so it's very difficult for them because they're finding it very difficult to supply their troops there. The Russians have some pretty decent drone coverage in this area. And as you can see over here, as we go further to the west, the Russians are making some gains according to both mappers. South of Konstantinivka, moving up this highway, the T0504 that comes through Konstantinivka. Okay, so the claim here that the Ukrainians have counterattacked near Yablonivka here. So we'll put that on the map. So Yablonivka is here. So actually the other mappers here, Andriivka and Surat maps, showing that the Russians have made some gains here, but Grayskull saying actually no, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back, but that could well be in the grey zone. Let's have a look to see where we are really there. Okay, so Yablonivka. Let's get a sense of position. Yeah, so if you see the curve of the road, this other road that comes down there, and this kind of lake area. If we go back to this map, you got that curve, the lake area, and then you've got another gentle curve down here. If we look as to what is essentially horizontal to there, then you get a sense of where the front line might be. So there, and really, there's only this salient there coming up. So just really from there. So essentially, all of this area here is not under Russian control, as according to Grayskull. So all of that area is either grey zone. So that's actually grey zone to the south of there, but actually Ukrainian control of Yablonivka, which is there. So interesting, that's a disagreement with this map, and it would look something like the Russian defensive line would look something like this. Let's draw on the map. I haven't done that for too long. So yeah, let's get the Russian defensive line. It's going to be something like that. Something like that, right? And then Ukrainian line exists. The Ukrainian defensive line itself would be something like here. And then this is grey zone in there. Okay, so that's at least one mapper's interpretation is disagreeing with these two mappers. So, take it all with a pinch of salt. That was a few days ago, though. So that might have changed since then. Right, Toretsk, as we are in the Toretsk area. So this is just over here. That is Toretsk there. We're going to be focusing on this area. Delivka here, Dachna, and so on and so forth. Right. Toretsk, fresh exclusive info, literally came out right now, he said, but again, this is 3 days ago. Incredibly, there's still Ukrainian resistance, no info on how large it is, but likely quite small in the western and northwestern outskirts of Toretsk city. The Russians continue shelling them. Strong attacks towards Katyinivka and Shebyanivka and Petrivka. So that's over here, there. And all repelled. The Azov contingent in Shebyanivka lives up to its standards, so they are keeping the Russians at bay in this pocket there. But if Klebenbik were to be lost, that's up here, the Ukrainians would have to retreat to Lake Pleshchivka, Oleksiivka-Shultina line, so back over here. According to the guys, everything south would be untenable. In other words, if this town gets taken because the Russians are attacking through here, then they'd have to pull out of all of these areas and pull back to over there and probably behind the lake. Okay, so movement from the Terrakon to St. Matrona of Moscow mine is confirmed. The Russians did not gain a foothold in Bilahora, 100% under Ukrainian control. Okay, so Bilahora is up there, 100% under Ukrainian control. And then down here, you get to talk about these different Terrakons. There's a Terrakon there. Some movement there possibly. Could be the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back a little bit in that area. And then finally, the Russians are currently using a very large amount of FPVs to suppress the Ukrainians. That's what I said. That's what I said the last couple of times. This is an area where the Russians appear to have maybe a drone advantage here. They've really hammered the Ukrainians' ability to supply their troops in the area due to that proliferation of drones. Now, Konstantinivka, fresh from info from the field. Now, this is from today. So that was play file from 3 days ago. From today, the front line is as follows. The Russians have been stopped in Yablunivka, so they redirected their focus to reaching Stepanivka. So that's just what it's telling you. Yablunivka here, there could be some gains there from the Ukrainians, not reflected in that map. So they redirected their focus to reaching Stepanivka from the west, north of the road. The Russians have not come close to Katyinivka. Okay, so this is looking at Stepanivka by coming from this direction rather than through Yablonivka, and they haven't reached Katyinivka there either. So near Toretsk, in Bilahora, there are no Russian controls, so it's still no Russian control for the town of Bilahora, or the village of Bilahora there. Bilahora. I can confirm the Russian advancements made on July the 9th and reported by Deep State in the same evening. Russian forces advanced near Leodinivka, Chernibivka and Zabalka district of Toretsk, which is completely occupied by the Russians now. I was also able to get very interesting information from all of the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, but I'll wait for my source to allow me or not to publish it. So some gains for the Russians possibly in the areas that you see indicated there. That's probably what he's referring to in this neck of the woods. That seems to where Azov are holding out. And then when we come further to the west, we have some gains for the Ukrainians around a place called Popov Yar. And we'll look at a couple of these sources. So Ukrainians liberated Popov Yar, or Popov Yar, depending on how it's transcribed. There we have Grey Skull, here we have Visioner saying big news. As a result of successful counteroffensive, the armed forces of Ukraine have liberated the village of Popov Yar on the Donetsk front. So that is this area, and that's quite significant. According to Surrey maps, a quite significant area of land that Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back in. And that halts that continued advance to the north, certainly in that particular area. But it's slightly worrying as they're advancing to the west here, over that T0504 highway. Remember that junction down there they were fighting over for ages. Then they used a motorcycle attack to get up to Novosilka and then across the road, and then it just kept advancing. And as they advance further west and further west, they're getting closer and closer to Minohrad and indeed Pokrovsk, and then they would seek to kind of envelop those towns by moving to the north here and somewhat encircling it. So definitely a concern, that area, for the Ukrainians. What else do we have? I think then we're going on further to the south to Moravka, right? Yeah. Okay, so let's just then move past Pokrovsk. We're going to go past Kotlina, and Udachny, where there are no changes there. So that's good news for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians had some success pushing back into Solone and indeed into Pischane, but that seems to have been repelled, and now it's been fairly stable around here, give or take. But some claims that the Russians have advanced around Moravka, while that's Surat maps claiming that, while other mappers indicate that actually Moravka has been retaken by the Ukrainians, is under Ukrainian control. Here you have an indication that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back, and it doesn't look like the map that you see there, but it certainly looks very different to what Andrew Perpetua has. So Andrew Perpetua has the Russians right the way back here, and all of this is grey zone, whereas even, Visioner here has a lot of this not under as grey zone, but actually Russian control. Okay, then we're going to come to, where's the next one? Alexandro Kalinyove. Okay, let's find out where that is. So different to the red pins there, actually claims that those should be blue pins, moving the Russians back there. We're going to come down to Dachna and this area here. So quite a bit of activity taking place here around Yalta, Dachna, and even further around as well. So it could be that the Ukrainians have retaken some areas here. If you look, there's a river here. Much of the front line for Surat maps is just following the river and claiming that Ukrainians have everything south of the river there. So just trying to work out where that was. I did look at that previously. Bear with me a second. So yeah, really we're talking about this area, Dachna, and some of the tree lines around here and stuff north of the river there. So you've got the river, I think, coming up here. And over there is a settlement that equates to, I think, this place. So we're talking about this general area. So the Ukrainians have recaptured Dachny. That's been, I think I talked about that last time as well. It was north of the river and the Russians had a foothold there, and it looks like the Ukrainians are pushing them back. So the Ukrainians counterattacking in Dachny, Novopavlovsk direction, as well as having some success further up. I think it's going to be, I don't know, somewhere around here. There's I get a little bit confused far too easily these days. But somewhere around here, I think is, I think it might be around Yalta even. But anyway, there is some talk. I did have a claim somewhere else that Yalta was, do we have here? Donetsk front in the area of Oleksiivka, the armed forces of Ukraine, as a result of successful counter-offensive, expelled the Russian occupiers from the settlement, regained control of the village, and restored positions to the south of it. But yeah, though that has to be somewhere. Where is that? It could be somewhere else entirely. But I have also heard that the Ukrainians have been pushing in the Yalta area as well. So anyway, as we come round the side here, the Russians are, as you can see, having quite some success on that part of the front, but actually fairly solid further down to the south. As we get past that Velyka Novosilka line there and going around a corner. So yeah, slight gain for the Russians there according to Surat maps. But this is the main area of Russian gain, as well as over here, just going to the northeast of Pokrovsk and then over around Konstantinivka as well. So those are your three main areas, I think, of Russian gains over the last 4 days. But quite a few areas where the Ukrainians might be pushing back. And then around here, around Kamyanska, according to Surat maps, the Russians pushing through the town, maybe getting across that river there and pushing forward. And this could be a worry. This might be one of the areas where the Russians are really seeking to push in Zaporizhzhia, part of their kind of supposed Zaporizhzhian offensive, because it, like we've seen with Sumy and with Kharkiv, the closer they can get to major cities like this, the more they can make life hell for the citizens there by hammering them with multiple launch rockets systems and artillery and whatnot. So it could be that this is the site of the Russian offensive, but it may be that they have moved troops away from there up to Sumy to try and cope with defending they're defending against the counterattack because they were attacking up in Sumy, of course. We hear today, I think, is it Melitopol? Some areas been hit there. I don't know if the Ukrainians are trying hard to stop troop accumulations and stop any offensive taking place in Zaporizhzhia. We've seen a lot of trains be attacked around Tokmak, a lot of fuel movements and possibly equipment movements around here. So it could be that rather than deal with the Russian attack as it happens, you try and stop the attack from happening in the first place by hammering command HQs, logistics, fuel and whatnot. So if we see continued focus around the Tokmak Melitopol area here, Polohi, we heard the other day another commander was killed in Polohi, right? So if you're hearing commanders being killed, that means an HQ or some kind of command center a command node has been struck. We've got cruise missiles being used actively along the front lines now. So yeah, if that is happening around here, I think it's the Ukrainians possibly, and this is massively speculative, of course, possibly trying to preempt the Russians, trying to stop them from having as successful and large an attack in the area, whilst also trying to divert attention away to other areas where they're pushing the Russians back. But anyway, that's just my tuppence halfpenny there for you. My tuppence. Now, just on that southern front line, this is Yalta, and that was in the wrong area. I knew I had something on Yalta, just put it in the wrong area. There's Yalta. So it looks like after several weeks, and this is from 4 days ago, several weeks of attempts and successful counterattacks, the armed forces of Ukraine have regained the northern part of the village of Yalta, located south of the Vovcha River in the Velyka Novosilka district of the Donetsk front. This has enabled the establishment of a foothold on the riverbank, paving the way for further offensive operations. So that's good news. And just to remind you where we're talking about there, here is Yalta. So that gets them across the river, gets the Ukrainians across the river. So if they have a purchase there, a foothold there, then that's going to be good for them. And it gives the Russians something to think about if they're pushing further to the west, further down south from there. Then, if the Ukrainians are able to get across the river and come down north of them there, then that's going to present some problems, something for the Russians to think about. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, guys. I really appreciate your support, and I will speak to you soon. Toodle pips.